Yeah, I think at the core of it, for me personally, there was a large shift in understanding, the best way to train a quarterback from like a long-term athletic development model. And initially, in more of the linear teaching methodology where, it's like we got to complete step one before we can, get to step two to step three. What we started seeing was, there'd be players that, had the ability to make unbelievable throws that didn't fit necessarily into the traditional, mindset of get over the top and extend to your target and step here with your left foot and put your right foot here. And so for me, it was a shift in letting an athlete kind of self-discover through a lot of their own, work on the field and in games, and then kind of giving them a framework instead of very rigid rules.
I'm joined today by Will Hewlett, who we've had on the podcast several times, quarterback developer and trainer, a guy who works in the private world to train top-level elite quarterbacks, doing that now at a 6 Points in Jacksonville. And usually this time of the year, I catch up with Will and we talk about some of the developments and things that he's seeing in the world of quarterback play. So, Will, it's great to have you back here on the podcast, and Happy New Year to you.
Awesome, Keith. I appreciate you having me back on.
So, Will, I want to start with the Sports Illustrated article, and I believe this was beginning of December. This came out as a cover article called How the NFL Learned to Love Creative QBs by Connor Orr, and you are interspersed throughout this article talking about quarterback play. So for our listeners, I've read it, but for our listeners, I guess if you could just give us an overview of some of the ideas that you shared in that article.
Yeah, absolutely. So Connor reached out to me, and he had basically seen quarterbacks in the NFL, and this was written in November, and there was just numerous elite throws that were being made by a number of different quarterbacks, from Kyler Murray to Mahomes and Josh Allen and obviously Aaron Rodgers. And it kind of stood out to him that we're seeing more and more creativity and adaptive playing in the NFL than we probably ever have before. Guys are playing a little bit more outside the box than they ever have before. And so his idea was like, why is this happening and where is it going? And, is it a result of, more athletic people playing quarterback? Is it, coaching, combination? So the general gist of the article is, what are some of the things that are happening developmentally and maybe some of the younger levels, and maybe how a coach's perception changing a little bit about, how we coach or not coach, let guys just kind of make plays, where that's coming from and why that's happening. That was the general gist of the article.
I think back to when I first met you in 2009, and we were working at the time. It was called, I believe, Darren Slack Quarterback Academy. We're the Quarterback Academy in Hilliard, Ohio. It was like 2009, I think, maybe right before I started as a quarterback coach at Baldwin Wallace. And it was, very programmed way of training a quarterback, and certainly I would say, I don't want to say developing, robots in the game, but, very rigid, and this is how a quarterback is trained. And now you see a lot of fluidity. You see a lot of different arm angles. You see the quarterbacks working different with their base, and just a huge evolution, I think, in the creativity that you see out of the quarterbacks, but also in the athleticism, that it's not always that the arm has to be at this angle and this is the perfect launch point. And you see guys just making plays because they're able to adapt and adjust and do different things. What do you attribute to that change that we've seen? And we've talked about this before, but I think it's progressed even more. What do you attribute that to as we've moved along the spectrum from, I guess, the old way of coaching quarterbacks to some of the new things you're seeing now?
Yeah, I think at the core of it, for me personally, there was a large shift in understanding, the best way to train a quarterback from like a long-term athletic development model. And initially, in more of the linear teaching methodology where, it's like we got to complete step one before we can, get to step two to step three. What we started seeing was, there'd be players that, had the ability to make unbelievable throws that didn't fit necessarily into the traditional, mindset of get over the top and extend to your target and step here with your left foot and put your right foot here. And so for me, it was a shift in letting an athlete kind of self-discover through a lot of their own, work on the field and in games, and then kind of giving them a framework instead of very rigid rules. And I still understand that at the core of the game, you need your quarterback to run your system. You need them to be able to, move through progressions and understand the process behind each play. But on the flip side of it, if you want to win championships, you need someone that can also turn that bad play call or that missed block or, create something out of nothing, to play at an elite level. And so I personally felt that we were coaching the creativity out of quarterbacks. It always has to be this way, and that's how you're going to be consistent. And so you have to learn to live with a little bit of failure, and encourage maybe, a quarterback maybe going off structure a little bit in certain situations if you want them to make plays. And, for years, Aaron Rodgers was kind of probably who we think of the most as, the last probably 20 years or so, who's been the most creative in their play in terms of inside the pocket, outside the pocket. There's the play that's called, and then there's the play that's run. But the feedback was always, from coaches at higher levels, like, don't do any of that stuff. That's just what Aaron does, and Aaron's super talented. Well, it almost felt like when Mahomes came, it's like, wow, we have another quarterback that is kind of allowed to execute within the system and then outside of the system. That started giving people, like, wow, well, maybe if we give guys a little bit more freedom and creativity, allow for that a little bit more, there's other players out there that are going to be able to really maximize their skill sets. And I think with the combination of, from a coaching standpoint, especially in college football, where the most athletic player on the field would either be put at tailback or wide receiver, that kid now is getting an opportunity to play quarterback. And so, there's much more situations now where there's breakdowns in plays, and that kid's going to extend the play. And I think the coaching mindset overall has started to shift, a little bit more to what if we encourage this? In the training world, the private training sector, probably the last 3 years, the emphasis on creativity and adaptive solutions, a little bit more of a free play approach to training, I think has really been emphasized, permission to use multiple arm angles. And so the spread of knowledge through trainers, obviously through social media, and there's some really great teachers out there, from like Bobby Stroop, who works with Mahomes, the influx of the movement, biomechanical specialists out there, I think that's kind of bled into the training and opened the eyes to a lot of people where the traditional, 3-step drop and get over the top and rip that slant, there's only so much you can do with that. And how do we keep younger players engaged and allow them to really capitalize on their talents?
Yes, I think one of the things we've seen just in football training in general is more and more of the movement specialists, those guys who understand movement, how to train movement, thinking about things like movement literacy, all those things you kind of mentioned, that it's more of that free play and self-discovery about, oh, wow, I could do this as an athlete, instead of the highly programmed stuff. And I think there's a place for both of those, but I think too much sometimes we rely on those very programmed types of drills, right? If you talk to one of the movement specialists I've had on here is Sean Mishka, and you bring up the speed ladder with him, and he just Sean loses his mind, because that's just a very programmed way of doing things, and it's not necessarily how things happen. Again, you get really good at running a speed ladder, and that not translate to you being a great football player, right? That you have to learn how to move in different ways. And Sean and I, back a few years, did a series during the year. He still does it, picks out his movement player of the week and the things he saw in there, and we kind of would engineer some drills on how do you create some of the things like this that guys have the ability to use their athleticism, their quickness, their agility out on the field when, especially, because we draw those lines in all those different ways. Well, that line ends and then stuff is still happening beyond that, right? And those are the things that, you can't just train from do the drill this way and it has to be this way. And there's going to be things that now start to happen outside of that. So your thoughts on, I guess, the evolution of using those guys more and more. I know Kurt Hester, who now I think is at Tulane, he was at Louisiana Tech. At one point prior to the season, he's like, more than ever, like these coaches I'm working with have discovered I can provide them a lot of value. So I'm out at practice all the time and looking at their drills and, meeting with them afterwards on how we can make these things better. So I think that's all those things are starting to come together, not just with quarterbacks overall with football, but you definitely have seen that in the quarterback world.
No, absolutely. And Sean has been one of those guys also on the forefront of maybe, giving coaches a different way to look at things. It always frustrated me trying to differentiate myself in the industry as a coach. We find ourselves trying to fill time, maybe on the individual play individual time standpoint. It's like, what drills are we going to, do? And it's the old, like, jump up, step over bags and, shuffle around these cones. And it's like, if you really boil it down, are we really getting them better at the game itself? And the irony always is the complexity and chaotic nature of football. As coaches, we're trying to control everything and just understanding that, it's tough to sit back as a coach and watch an athlete go through something and it doesn't look necessarily as clean or doesn't look as structured. I think when you give athletes a permission to kind of self-discover and be creative, you have to be okay with some stuff being not as clean the first couple times. But what you find is if you can create environments that are more representative of the game, you get better at the game itself. It's like, we're not here to get better at stepping over cones. We're here to get better at adapting to the environment. So coaches, I think, have done a good job. I've had more coaches than I ever have before at different levels, reach out and question maybe some of the approaches they've had in practice and how can they better use that practice time. So it's nice to see that shift. We're seeing it in younger quarterbacks. They're a little bit more further along than maybe 10, 15 years ago. And the gameplay, even at the high school level, is more exciting than ever with some of the stuff we're seeing out of quarterbacks with their skill sets.
When you take this to the practical level, you work with quarterbacks specifically on their skills, and obviously quarterback coaches that are with a team not only have to work on the skill, but now have to work with things within context, right? All the situations, all those things there. So if you were to say, hey, my recommendations for this and understanding what you need to work on during the season, but at the same time still wanting to be able to sharpen a player's skill, anything, I guess, that was really traditional that you say, hey, move away from this and move more towards these things as far as drilling and practice programming?
Absolutely. The last 2 years I've been the quarterback coach at St. Augustine High School, traditionally in North Florida, one of the best public school programs in the state of Florida. And, it's been a really interesting journey for myself because, I've been stuck in this training world for, 17 years or so. And then I was like, I'm going to go try to be a real football coach. And there was a learning curve for me that was pretty steep at first, trying to get out of the training mindset and more into the football coach mindset. And what was, helpful for me to understand was, if you look at the year of a quarterback and how they develop over, a 12-month period, you have to, the core of your offense, in terms of, whether it's drops and it's timing on particular throws, understanding the tactical side of the game. I think a lot of that stuff has to be accomplished in the off season. And if you're trying to bring a quarterback up to speed, in the beginning during fall, and obviously, you're going to have situations where you have guys get injured or players, the roster is going to change. But I feel like the season focus, we're going to build the fundamentals in the off season, build the structure in the off season, and then, with 7-on-7 and all these other things, I think you give athletes an opportunity to kind of feel out what they're capable of. Like 7-on-7 is a great example where, you might want to be a little bit less structured in how a quarterback moves through progression, let them feel out what their limitations are as a thrower, be okay if they throw an interception, let them learn from those lessons. When we shift into the season, the one thing that stood out to me is in terms of individual time, there wasn't a whole lot I felt like I wanted to do individually with the quarterbacks from a mechanical standpoint. Naturally, players are going to have a little bit of regression through the season in terms of, maybe the structure and footwork. There's a little bit of sloppiness. They kind of settle into what they feel comfortable with. And so being kind of adaptive in terms of how you are as a coach and saying, okay, he's more comfortable taking a punch step first, or he's more comfortable with the right foot back in the stance and shotgun or under center. But spending time individually with my quarterbacks became less and less of a priority. So, where you could go spend 15 minutes doing some bag drills and throwing to a net, I really felt that time is best spent always working with another position group. The more we could throw to moving targets, with laid decisions and creating an environment where they have to have some kind of live stimulus, really, I felt translated better into quarterback play during the season. I just felt like from my experience as a trainer, if you're focusing on mechanics and it's not that you don't want to completely forget that stuff, but we need to win games. And so the more you can work with other position groups and stuff that's a little bit more applicable to gameplay, I think the better off you are. That's one thing that stood out. So less of the QBs by themselves time. And obviously you got to get stuff set up with protections and, understanding progressions. And that's a good use of that time. But working with other position groups, I thought was a part of the game that, maybe is glossed over a little bit too much and should be more, because, football is not really an individual sport. I mean, I get it. You got to get good at routes and you got to be able to write good at drops, but that timing has to be linked together. And it's hard to create that without full speed routes and receivers or tailbacks, so that's, I think, some of the best things that really helped me understand how to be a better coach in this past couple seasons.
I'm sure now, in stepping more into that role and that quarterback coach during the season, that, in the training world, even though you'll do some pocket presence drills and simulate some pressure in different ways, the chaos that really doesn't give them those clean looks and those clean feelings needs to be a part of this as well. It's easy to do things in a 7-on-7 or routes on air. So what kind of things did you feel were of most value to you in training quarterbacks, especially in those environments now where there's guys flying all over the place, guys flying by them and having to move to find windows to throw, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can't, nothing replaces the live reps. One thing that stood out to me actually was scout team 7-on-7. So when we were servicing the defense with, the other team's offense in 7-on-7 periods, one thing we noticed with our quarterbacks is they had a little bit more of a carefree attitude in terms of, hey, I'm going to fit this ball in here and take a chance on this throw, or I'm going to look off someone longer than I ever have before. Integrate, shoulder fakes and subtle movements. And I really felt that, the pressure of being perfect when you're running your offense, sometimes can create an environment for your quarterback where they're afraid to make mistakes. Mm-hmm. And, scout 7-on-7 where the pressure's off. Like if you throw a pick, we're just moving on to the next play. I think that mindset, trying to find a way to marry that up. And again, it's like, I'm not saying be okay with interceptions, be okay with them, completely forgetting the progression. But, sometimes it's good if someone's open and it's not in the progression, they hit that receiver, we got to be good with that. That's a great play. So as a coach, finding a way to kind of mesh together the mindset of, hey, let's service the defense. We don't really care, just run the play. I think bleeding some of that mindset in, I think really is helpful for, young quarterbacks and quarterbacks trying to figure out, the timing and what they're capable of. As a coach, that's stood out to me. And it's hard to do, right? Because we want, your stuff to be run perfect. If you look at some of Patrick Mahomes' high school film, there's a lot of plays there where you scratch your head and you're like, gosh, like, I don't even know how you would coach that. And look at Texas Tech, some of the no-look passes and the craziness that came out there. And now we see it in the NFL. So just having that trust in your guys and being able to self-discover a little bit, I think is super important. You always look at it like when I first got my driving license, leading up to that moment, I took my test and I was now by myself in the car. That's when I really learned how to drive. I didn't have someone sitting there telling me what to do. And yeah, that could be a bad thing, but for me, it was really, really good. And I really felt like I understood, I could feel out the limits of the vehicle. I grew up in a racing family. My dad was a race car driver growing up. So being in that environment is really where I learned how to drive. And I think if you take that mindset to quarterbacks, again, I've said this many times, sometimes the best coaching is no coaching, just keeping your mouth shut and moving on to the next play and seeing if they can learn from that mistake.
I know on the technology side, that's something you've always been involved in. I'm trying to think back to 2009. People weren't really using it in football, but the slow motion analysis, I think it was Dartfish maybe was the software program back then. Yeah. So certainly there's been a lot of evolution in the use of technology and how you use that to train quarterbacks. And you mentioned to me before we got going, 3D motion capture now is something that you're starting to utilize.
Absolutely. I think it's amazing you can use your phone and get 240 frames per second in a 2D environment, and you can learn a lot from that. I think that's been a huge advantage personally for myself. I think it's sped up quarterback development. One thing I realized is, early on as I shift more into the, more of the biomechanical approach, so to say, a scientific approach, I started realizing as good as an eye as I have for seeing certain things mechanically failing or being out of sync, at the core of it, you really can't tell, are they getting enough separation between their hips and their shoulders? There's certain cues if it's extreme, but 3D motion capture and having access to that technology has been really eye-opening as a coach, going, maybe I should leave some of these other things alone as a coach, because I really don't know if I'm creating something that's going to transfer into their actual throwing. But having, a bank of quarterbacks that you have data on and being able to see, okay, so great throwers always have the hips fired before the trunk, and there's up to, 35 degrees of separation between the hips and the shoulders, which is kind of an optimum amount, right? Can I really see that with my eyes? Probably not. Can I tell the difference between 20 degrees and 30 degrees? Probably not. So as a coach, I really have now put that side of my training, subcontracted that part of it out, and, get with guys that understand the true way to pattern, correct movements in throwing. And then when we're on the football field with the football, we're trying to implement what we know about that specific athlete and cue them on certain things that they can maybe feel, that they've gathered from the data, they've gathered from the warm-ups, they've gathered from the patterning drills, but really letting them now self-discover in that moment with the football in their hand. And so that was a big shift in my coaching, where now I look at myself a little bit more from the artist standpoint. If you look at it like I'm trying to create a finished product and give feedback to the athlete, whereas before I was trying to do it all. I was trying to get guys to snap their hips faster or get more separation between the shoulder, more flex in the knee, less flex in the knee. So whatever the data tells us, certain things we're going to stay away from. And we understand now that not all throwers, where the sequence itself at its core is the same, throwers will fit into different categories. And some guys, we're not going to have their front shoulder flash inside as much. Some guys do a better job of just firing their hips aggressively without much shoulder movement. And so that shift in the training world has been really helpful for me, stepping back and going, well, I don't have to do it all, and being really comfortable with what I'm good at and doubling down on that.
One thing that kind of has become viral for you on social media, but you've talked about it for a long time. You identified it, I think, following some things on your social media history, maybe back in 2015, you were teaching it, and it's mentioned in the article, actually, when you're introduced, the idea of the foot pop, right? So for our listeners, maybe who aren't familiar, explain what the foot pop is and why it's become an important thing for a guy like Aaron Rodgers, and I guess also you see it and use it in training with other quarterbacks as well.
Absolutely. So the foot pop was something, being an obsessive quarterback coach and always at my heart a Packers fan. I was a huge Brett Favre fan, and then it was very, very easy to continue to be a Packers fan with Aaron Rodgers. Kind of reverse engineering some of the things that he did. I noticed in about 2014, 2015 that he was doing this bizarre thing with his foot where he would make contact with the ground, and it kind of goes away from traditional sense of front foot strike. We want a heavy foot in the ground. Front foot strike correlates with velocity more than any other part of the throw. Traditionally, we're thinking, pushing up the back leg and driving to the target from an old mindset. And what we understood is that like a solid front foot strike with good blocking in the lead leg really helps decelerate that front side and help us create some torque through the body. And so then you've got this guy that's got the most unbelievable arm, leaves the ground with that front foot almost as the ball is coming out of his hand. And so just from messing around in the facility by myself, I kind of figured out a way to do it. And in about 2015, I had a small group of athletes that I started experimenting it with. And McLeod Bethel-Thompson, who's one of the best quarterbacks in the CFL, played in the NFL, was kind of one of the key athletes that we utilized this with. And for a long time, I kept it quiet. Like I thought, like I've got something that no one else has. And so McLeod had gotten back to me after, I think at that point he was with the Dolphins. And he's like, I'm able to make throws that I wasn't able to make before. I'm able to snap my hips, continue, especially on escaping outside the pocket, create a lane, a strike zone for throwing that allowed them to get their arm through and not pull out a fall out of the throw. And the funny thing about this is that we went deep into this foot pop and then started, kind of a standard teaching for guys that had figured out the rest of the throwing. And at some point, smart quarterback coaches will notice other players doing it. And so Brad Stanfield, a coach in Texas, had been someone that works with a lot of great quarterbacks in Texas at the college level and the pro level. And, he was a guy that started implementing in that movement with a lot of his quarterbacks and found out, wow, this like really, really helps kind of organize everything on movement. And so, fast forward, it gets out there on social media a little bit, and then you start seeing quarterbacks all across the country. Danny Hernandez has been a guy that's in Southern California that's been doing this forever with his cues. I know the 3D QB guys also had started implementing it into their training. And it's not for everyone. It works for some people. And, at first when we started using it, I had quarterbacks that would tell me, their college coaches would be like, knock that crap off, like stop doing it. Doesn't make sense. And others wouldn't care. They just didn't understand it. So I went kind of on a mission to, the irony was I felt like it hadn't been talked about in a mainstream standpoint. And the guy that, you see it happen maybe intuitively with other quarterbacks, but I felt like Aaron Rodgers had, conscious thought behind this particular move. You'd see it in his warm-ups. You would start to see it in other Packers quarterbacks. And so I was like, this guy really had put some thought into this. And so the cool thing was is through the Sports Illustrated article is Connor got a chance to chat with Aaron in person on the phone. And the irony behind it all is this is something that he created in his backyard, probably got done watching a couple episodes of The Office. And his thought behind it was, how do I take his left knee was bothering him and he wanted to take pressure off his knee when he was throwing. And so he started messing around with this. And in his words, it's a way for me to organize all of my arm angles and creative throws into one move. We actually were so intrigued by it that we got quarterbacks to do the foot pop on the motion capture. And what we found is that the separation between the hips and the shoulders was not as great as they popped the foot, but it moved everything quicker and it decelerated everything quicker. So it was like a natural way to sync up hips and shoulders and then create a ton of velocity off of movement with the arm. And now, you scroll social media, you've got 10-year-old quarterbacks out there popping their feet. We've got quarterbacks that come into the facility and camps that are doing it. Sometimes you go back, hey, man, we got to knock that off. You got to, just focus on not having to do that every time. even my own son was banned from doing it for a while at practice because it became one of those things where he'd rely on it too much. But again, it's a unique move. I think it has a place in quarterback play for a lot of quarterbacks. We have people specifically like, hey, when can we learn the foot pop? Yeah, just think of it as a way to organize, proper sequencing on certain moves in the pocket and outside the pocket.
Yeah, that's awesome. And you see really the effect of social media, right? And you think about this, becoming mainstream. I know you've been working with it for a while, but go back to maybe before the days before this. How long would that have taken really to get out and become mainstream to the camp circuits and quarterback developers and guys? Probably doesn't even make its way into a coach's clinic where people are talking about it. And now,
right,
almost instantaneously with the way things work, that if something works for somebody, everybody's going to take a look at it, investigate it, maybe try it out and use it. And I think that's where we're at with information as well, that, you look at quarterback development and really anything in football, is that the information is easier to get than ever.
Absolutely. It's blessing and a curse, social media, but there's no doubt, like, we spend, how much time we spend kind of browsing and seeing what other people are doing out there. I was a lot more active on posting, some of my thoughts and approaches in quarterback training early on in the day. I kind of shift away from that a little bit, and just for my athletes, I felt like I owed them a little bit of privacy, and didn't have to feel like I have to post everything they do. From a business standpoint, I don't need new clients. Got a good word of mouth business set up. So, but the great thing about it is you do create some awesome relationships, and there's things that come up, and we all have those group text threads where it's like, oh, did you see this? What's this? And a lot of times there's a little bit of, up front, there can be some frustration or like, why are they even doing that? That makes no sense. But then you find yourself trying that on the field a little bit later. So I love it for that fact. I try to, keep tabs on the industry, stay aware of what's going on. And, it gives me an opportunity to connect with maybe someone and, a couple thousand miles away and learn about what they're trying to do. Yeah, there's definitely some great advantages to it. And some people out there that put out some great content absolutely do.
One thing that's been amazing for me in doing this podcast, and I can't believe, now we're into year 6 here, going into year 6 of the podcast.
Yeah.
Started out with, I look back to that first year, maybe we might have had a couple 100,000 listens, and we just hit 7 million the other day, 7 million listens lifetime. And I mean, the way it's tracking is going to be even more than that. So, the networking that has come through has been incredible. And it was one of our conversations we had, I think, in the first year. And you told me about this group called QB Collective.
Yeah.
And,
yeah.
And then from there, an introduction to Richmond Flowers, who's the visionary behind that and the founder of QB Collective. And then, together we worked on some things with USA Football, and you were out there in LA, and I think we did that in the summer of 2019. And, it was really neat to see just your role in that, and we were out at another event just this past May that guys do rely on you for some of the things you think about with quarterback play. And I won't say the guys who were coming up, but I'm talking very high level guys coming up and talking to you and asking you questions and picking your brain about quarterback play. And I'm sure you get a lot back from them too that you take from it. But I guess the way you've seen that organization, that group develop, the QB Collective, at first you told me about it, I was like, I don't know what that is. What is it? And now it's, you start to see this everywhere, and certainly the quarterbacks out there, the young quarterbacks are aware of it. What have you seen, I guess, and how has that been important for you in your development as a coach?
Yeah, absolutely. I think at the core of it, especially for someone like myself who didn't have the NFL pedigree, I have no brothers, sisters, fathers, mothers that are, anyone that was affiliated with anything in the NFL. And, I was just a guy that, had a dream of making it to the NFL and didn't make it. And so then it's like that door is closed, and it's like, we want to know what the best is doing. If you're a driven coach, it's like, I want to have access to that information. And so I think the initial vision was like, how can we provide the information to the younger athlete that's only been reserved for, the NFL quarterbacks and NFL players and NFL coaches. And, just as much as that helps an athlete to get a chance to work with, Matt LaFleur or Sean McVay or Rich Gangrello or whoever it may be, I got the opportunity to sit right alongside that. My first year at QB Collective, I was picking up cones and holding a camera and moving stuff around. And then, there was a moment where I got a chance to sit down with Shane Waldron and talk a little bit about what I taught. And then, a chance to co-present with things. And so I get to ask questions. I'm like, okay, what is Matthew Stafford really doing on this concept? Why does Jimmy Garoppolo take this particular step? And then being able to get that answer has been helpful to help dictate what you teach and how you teach it. And I think one of the challenges we run into as coaches, the perfect example is the foot pop. I kind of reverse engineered it and figured out, well, I think this is why we do it. And I think this is what we want to do it for based on what we see. But the irony behind it is that some guy with an injury that was trying to find an adaptive way to throw it, right? And so getting that information goes, wow, like that's pretty interesting, perspective. And maybe we thought it was something else, and that's why he does it. And so we can look at that from, the NFL side. Now have a little bit of understanding of what, the true process behind some of the decisions and skills we see. So making that connection was really awesome for, again, someone that, we're not all going to play in the NFL. We're not all going to coach in the NFL. But, if we can help provide athletes better solutions and better answers and help coaches, understand the game, a lot, on a deeper level, that's awesome. And, it's not to say, again, some of the coaches I get a chance to work with at the high school level and the college level, my head coach, Brian Braddock, is one of the best football coaches I've ever been around. And so there's always great information out there from every level. But it's nice to pull back the curtain on the NFL level and see, like, okay, well, that's why they do it. And that's been really helpful as a coach and a mentor and someone that's just passionate about learning about the game.
Yeah, definitely. And it's been definitely fun for me to be able to get out to some of those events and just peek behind the door and see what's going on in the world of QB development and really to go around and talk to some of those coaches too and pick their brains about what they just do in coaching. It's been definitely an incredible experience. And Will, I appreciate you joining me again on the podcast and sharing some ideas here as we seem to do at this time of the year. And I'm sure that I'll be seeing you sometime in the future here at another QB Collective event.
Absolutely, man. I appreciate you having me back on, and always great to chop it up about QB play.